Hi everybody and welcome to today's session, 10 things every researcher needs to know about altmetrics. Thanks very much for joining us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Please pop any questions in the Q&A box. Let us know if you can't hear or see. And the webinar is being recorded and we'll send around the recording afterwards if you would like to view any sessions or share them with colleagues. On the call today we have myself, I'm Kat. I run operations here at Altmetric and I'm joined by our marketing executive Josh Clark. Today we'll cover a bit of an introduction to altmetrics, our top 10 things that we think researchers need to know, some tips for getting started, and at the end we'll have time for questions. So why are we here today? Really, this is all about how altmetrics fit into the research lifecycle. Altmetrics are really not just a buzzword, they play an important part in understanding the broader impact or influence that your research is having. So where it's being disseminated, read, or how it's being interpreted beyond just the academy. Because of course, research doesn't end with publishing your work. It's really more important to understand how it is actually used and the difference that it makes. And when we think about those different audiences that might be engaging with your work, they're much broader than perhaps they were previously. Journals are no longer relegated to the print versions on library shelves. Increasingly open access research is making your research visible to much broader audiences who are engaging with it and interpreting it in very different ways. Whether that's practitioners, patient groups who perhaps are interacting with it via Facebook, the funders who initially supported the project, and people within your own institution. So when we talk about altmetrics, what we really mean is indicators of non-traditional attention and engagement with digitally published research and scholarship. So altmetrics are not a measure of quality or of the approach to the research, but they can help you understand how it is being engaged with and where people are talking about it. And what does the term altmetrics really mean? Well, it kind of came from this idea of alternative metrics, and we'll talk a bit more later about what they're really alternative to, but essentially it's kind of designed to be complementary to the more traditional metrics which you might be more familiar with. And altmetrics track the online interactions with potentially any digital object produced in the research lifecycle. So not just your papers, but potentially your data sets, your images, your conference posters as well. And with that, I will hand over to Josh for our first point.
So, in at number one is altmetrics aren't just a number. So, at Altmetric, we capture mentions of research from a number of different sources, including commentary on social media, citations on Wikipedia, discussions on peer review platforms, coverage on news sites, and many, many more. So, this is one of the biggest misconceptions we come across. Just because the attention for a piece of research is increasing doesn't actually mean that attention is good. By just quoting numbers, you might be giving some indication of how much attention your research is having, but this can often be seen as quite opaque and requiring further context. Altmetrics provide the analysis of engagement, so you can tell what people are actually saying about your work. So here's a great example of a paper published in 2014 that received a tremendous amount of attention as soon as it was published. But when you dig into the mentions, it becomes apparent that the attention it was receiving was due to a mistake in the proofreading process where the authors had actually left a comment in and the paper actually got published including that comment. And this was picked up on by lots of news and blogs and on social media, and the attention increased, but that attention wasn't necessarily good.
That's not the only thing to bear in mind when you're thinking about altmetrics and how they can be used in context. I mentioned already that altmetrics are designed to be alternative to existing metrics, which is true, but they're not there to replace those existing metrics. They're really there to act as a complementary measure that can help you understand the broader influence and reach of a piece of research. So where traditional metrics such as citations or the impact factor only really tell part of the story and the part that exists within the academic sphere, altmetrics can help you trace a much broader picture of how your research is being disseminated and engaged with by different audiences that extend far beyond the academy. So the aim of altmetrics is to help you tell that more complete picture of your research, but also to help you see what's going on beneath the surface and outside of your own institution.
So, one thing to bear in mind is that altmetrics are much more immediate. So altmetrics can be used alongside traditional metrics to provide a much earlier indication of the impacts your research is having. They also have the added benefit of being tracked in real time. This means you don't have to wait until the score is released. Altmetrics data starts accruing as soon as your article is published. So, as we previously mentioned, Altmetrics gives a far more immediate view of the impact than traditional metrics. This graph shows a typical timeline of the online detention you could expect to see for the average research article. As you can see, the online mentions on Twitter and on news outlets appear very soon after publication, with Wikipedia citations following soon after, and then traditional citations following much later than that. So, Altmetric pick up these mentions as soon as they're online and make them available for you to view. Here's a few stats to give you an idea of the number of online mentions we track for research. So, Altmetric actually tracks a piece of research every 0.9 seconds. 245,000 new mentions of research are tracked a day, and 26,000 unique outputs are mentioned each day online. So that kind of gives you some context of the data that's out there and why it's so important.
Really excitingly, altmetrics aren't just for journal articles, they can also be applied to other types of research outputs to show how those outputs are being used or discussed by audiences around the world. For example, you can see here the types of altmetrics that can be collated for a book, where it's been mentioned in syllabi at academic institutions. So you can start to understand the influence of this work. This one here, which was published in 1992, still features in the reading list of 12 institutions today. So it's having a big influence on what today's scholars understand about this concept. You can also, of course, see where these things were picked up in social media or perhaps referenced in policy documents or on Wikipedia, for example. Also, with datasets, images, posters, and other outputs that have been assigned a unique identifier, you can see the reach and the conversations that are going on around them online. And you can start to get a sense of the influence that they're having and how they're being potentially reused.
You can also use Altmetrics to see who's talking about your work. So Altmetrics starts tracking your research as soon as it's published and immediately displays the mentions on Altmetric details pages like this one. Altmetric can also help you track the reach of your research, not just across online sources, but also where it's being mentioned across the world. This map visualization shows the countries which are mentioning this piece of research on Twitter. They can also be used to uncover high-profile mentions of your work, and from things like high-profile news outlets like Time magazine, and high-profile scientists on Twitter like Brian Cox here. They can also help you see where your research is being mentioned on specialist blogs like this one at the bottom of the screen. So if you're targeting a specific audience, this will give you some indication of that it's being read. So here's a great case study from Terry Moffat from Duke University. Terry actually uses Altmetrics data for staying abreast of trending research in her field and tracking engagement with her lab's research. Altmetric tools actually give Terry the ability to map the attention in order to better understand how to communicate her research to stakeholders worldwide.
But altmetrics don't just let you follow the conversations, they can help you understand and surface specific examples of the influence that your work is having. A lot of altmetrics is about figuring out which attention actually matters to you and what you're trying to achieve with your research. Many scholars, for example, would be keen to see where and how their research is referenced in policy from organisations and governments around the world. Others might be interested to find evidence of potential economic impacts via references made in patents. Altmetric tracks all of this and makes it easy to discover via the details pages for each item.
So, Altmetrics can also be used to boost your chances. Altmetrics can also be really useful when you're applying for new funding. Adding information on the engagement relating to any previous projects you've worked on can offer context and additional insights for review panels. Increasingly, funders are actually asking for this kind of thing. How will you communicate your work to a broader audience? And what real-world impact is it having? Altmetrics may not give you the full answer, but they can certainly offer you a great starting point. So here's a few tips we've put together for just how to use the data responsibly in these kind of applications. So percentiles can give you an extra layer of context for the attention your work is receiving by showing how it compares to other research published in the same journal or in the same year. You should use appropriate metrics, and to do this you should explain what the real-world outcomes of your research is having, and backing up that claim with the Altmetrics data. Sometimes the best way of evidencing the impacts your research is describing who's saying what about your research and how they're actually using it. Using long-form explanations of where your research has been mentioned can be used to do this. Here's a great example of how a researcher has provided long-form evidence of their research being mentioned in 4 patents, and also providing an example of the real-world impact that it's had.
But Altmetrics aren't just something to look at after you've published. You can use them in a much more proactive way to actually determine an engagement strategy that's suitable for you. When you're looking at the Altmetric data for other research in your field, which we suggest you do by perhaps going to the journal website or using a bookmarklet tool that we'll talk about later, it can be useful to consider the context and the outcomes of where that research has been mentioned. Take a look to see how the type and sentiment of attention varies from channel to channel. People sharing it on Facebook might talk about it or use it in a very different way to those who mention it on Twitter, or the people who take the time to provide a post-publication peer review. Understanding what's going on around other research in your field can help you figure out how your work can reach the people you wish to see it. Once you know more about where the research in your field seems to gather attention, you can use that insight to craft your own engagement strategy, ideally right from the start of your project. The outcomes you might want can help determine where you choose to publish it. For example, if one journal seems to receive a lot of references from policymakers or gets a lot of media attention, this might influence how you choose to distribute your outputs. There might be specific Facebook groups or hashtags that can help you reach your intended audience and that you might want to plan to engage with upon publication. Many people often ask about the link between Altmetrics and later academic citations, and several studies have been done that look more closely at this, some of which do show a positive correlation. In general, being more proactive about sharing your work to audiences it is likely to be relevant to goes a long way to getting it noticed and offers the potential for it to have a broader influence, either immediately or later on down the line.
So Altmetrics can also help you choose where to publish. They can do this by helping you identify the journals with the most reach, by seeing the articles that are being talked about the most and which actual publishers are publishing them. You can learn which journals are being read by your audience by seeing how much they're being discussed online, and which journal publishers are actually publishing those articles, and actually find journal publishers that can help you promote your work by seeing which articles are getting the most engagement, and then targeting your publication strategy to get published by those publishers. If your institution has access to the Altmetric Explorer for institutions, you can compare journals to see which ones get the most coverage on different online sources.
So that's perhaps our last and perhaps our most important point, that you can find Altmetrics really easily. Altmetric itself offers the data via various channels, including by clicking on the coloured donut badges that you find on many journal platforms, via the Altmetric Explorer platform that Josh just mentioned, which is a database that your institution might have site license access to, and via the Altmetric Bookmarklet, a browser plugin that can be found on the altmetric.com site. If your institution does have access to the Explorer, then that's great. It's particularly useful. It makes it easy to track attention over time, filter by author, subject, journal and more, and gives you the option to sign up for automated reports and email alerts, so you can be notified as soon as any of the research that you're interested in receives new attention online. But if you're still not sure where to start, we can certainly help. Do take a moment to visit the tips and tricks page on the Altmetric website, where there's lots of handy starter guides and videos to help point the way. And there are also some nice examples of how others have used the data in practice. So that's it for today. Thank you everyone for joining.